Hello everyone, how are you? Thank you for joining us this morning. It's great to see so many registered for this morning's webinar. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Marina Stanley. I'm the Director of the Training Accreditation Council Secretariat here, head up the Secretariat. We're really pleased with the content that we're able to produce through the education program that the Council has established, and many of you will know that we have worked to expand the topics available for you. And if you look soon into next year's schedule, you'll see that we have quite a variety of topics available for next year. So both face-to-face workshops and webinar, whatever suits you. So we've had some great success and some really fantastic feedback from those of you who have been participating. So thank you for that. And of course, we're always willing to hear the feedback that you have, where we can improve also, and any topics that you may like to suggest going into the future. So just to let you all know that a recording of this session and handouts will be available on the TAC website after the session. Just give us a few days to do that. And of course, we will be providing certificates of attendance for you also. So that will be useful to you, I'm sure. And I'd also like to respectfully acknowledge the Whadjuk people on whose land we record today and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So as we have done throughout our education program and going into the future, we utilise our extremely experienced and expert auditors who are on the TAC Auditor panel to help us with our education program, and today is no exception. As you know, we've Russell Docking today to present to you today's session. We're excited to launch. This is the first webinar where we're launching the latest edition of the TAC Users Guide to the Standards for RTOs. I hope you find today's session very useful. We've taken an approach to unpack each of the standards, each of the clauses for you through that user's guide, and it really is a great ready reckoner for you to use together with the variety of other resources that we have available, so that we really are able to provide you as much support and guidance as we can to help you with your compliance obligations in regards to the standards for RTOs. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Russell and enjoy today's session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina, and share my welcome to you to participate in today's session. This, of course, represents a classic example of TAC's commitment to providing as much support to RTOs, both those who are going through initial registration and those who are continuing their registration or seeking extensions to scope or the like. To make sure that you have the best opportunity to be able to establish processes and resources that enable you to show compliance and to do so in a way which leaves you feeling supported and nurtured through the process, rather than having to tackle this entirely on your own. So today we're going to run through a series of topics to introduce you to the user's guide, this new version. We're going to start off by briefly looking at the purpose of the standards for RTOs, and of course you're familiar with those, but it's important to understand that there is a distinct difference between the purpose of the standards and the purpose of the user's guide. And then we will move on and talk about how to use the user's guide, and we'll go through the sort of components of the user's guide and what they can convey to you and how they can support you. And then we'll reflect on the plethora of other TAC resources. Marina has already mentioned workshops, but there's also, of course, very strong collection of TAC Fact Sheets that relate to most of the issues that you'll find coming up within the context of the user guide. So you have, if you look at this whole collection, a very comprehensive set of resources to work from. When we think about the two, we of course have the standards for registered training organisations. It's a familiar document to you. We're now working with compilation number 3, and you have now the new user's guide. And it's important to understand that these have a different role. The purpose of the standards is to provide you with a clear statement of the requirements for quality assurance and compliance. So there is a sort of steel backbone in the standards, because there isn't room to negotiate. It isn't about options and choices. It's about requirements in terms of the outcomes, and we'll come back to that in a moment, of your assessment strategies and your training strategies and your systems. The user's guide, in contrast, provides support for quality assistance. So it's not so much quality assurance as quality assistance. And it's not so much about compliance, it's much more about advice to enable you and support you as you move towards compliance. So it's worth our while looking at these two particular documents in a little more detail. The purpose of the standards is, of course, to provide a legislative framework for the registration of training organisations. And so you'll see it when you look at the document that it has a federal government letterhead and the like, because it is, in fact, a regulatory requirement in terms of your role as an RTO. Then it provides a framework for internal and external audits to ensure that the quality of your systems in terms of training and assessment and other services that are relevant to your work as an RTO, that those standards are being met. The word framework, though, is really important, because it doesn't explicitly say how you will do these things, but rather what kind of level of outcome is required from a quality perspective. And then thirdly, it provides assurance of the quality and relevance of your training and assessment strategies to industry, employers, community and learners. So you can see that the standards are there also to give comfort and confidence to the community and to the stakeholders of the RTO system. But it also goes further. Another thing that it does for us is, in the next slide, is to ensure, we've lost it, there we go, to ensure the integrity and meaningfulness of nationally recognised qualifications issued by RTOs. And of course, the issuance of qualifications is one of the significant outputs of an RTO, because it's through those qualifications that an individual is able to build a career, an employer is able to trust on the competency repertoire of that individual, that the community and the clients of those employers and of those graduates can understand that they are being supported by people who have achieved a real and meaningful standard. So these standards serve to achieve all of those requirements, but we need to note also that they are not prescriptive in how you must operate, but rather what outcomes must be achieved, so that they are not saying that every RTO will be the same. Indeed, if we look at RTOs, we can see that they provide services in different industry areas for different learner cohorts, using different resources in different regions. One of the characteristics of VET is that it needs to be responsive to the needs of individuals and the particular needs of industry and the like. And that does mean that the standards are needed to ensure consistency and quality and uniformity and outcome, but at the same time allow flexibility, innovation and responsiveness. And that's why we often use the word framework, because it's you as an RTO that puts flesh onto the framework, and that will have character of its own. And as auditors and as TAC, we respect and in fact appreciate that individuality of an RTO. So the standards say this is what you must achieve, but they also provide you with a lot of room to be able to make your own decisions about how you achieve them. Each standard is made up of a set of clauses, and all relevant clauses must be demonstrated by an RTO for the standard to be achieved. The clauses are a bit like performance criteria in a unit of competency. They are basically saying, and we are basically saying, what do you need to be a competent RTO? Well, you need to achieve these standards, and within each standard, these are the indicators of what constitutes consistent and quality outcomes in terms of those, and those are represented in the clauses within each standard. So when we come to the user guide, what we are trying to do here is to express to you both the hard edge, if you like, of the standard itself, and then the responsive and flexible facets that you can bring into play when you are building your RTO and managing your RTO, and which you can use to review and monitor your RTO's operations. So it stands as a guide to both the rigor of being an RTO and the flexibility and responsiveness of being an RTO. So this document will help organisations that are applying to become an RTO. So it's a document that needs to be read by people who are putting together the resources and the systems and the policies and the procedures to become an RTO. But it also needs to be assigned a reference resource for current RTOs. You might be about to undergo an internal or an external audit, maybe for an extension to scope, or maybe it's your regular review, or maybe there's some other reason that an audit is in place. This document will give you insights into the sorts of evidence that you might provide and the sorts of expectations that might be laid upon you in terms of the audit process. So it's both for initial registration and for ongoing and continuing registration. But you will find in the document, and I'll refer to this a bit later on, that there are specific paragraphs which are signposted as being of particular importance to an initial registration process. And it's also used, of course, by people like myself, auditors and other regulatory staff, to make sure that we are working in a consistent, fair and flexible way. It's interesting, of course, that those sorts of words which come from the principles of assessment apply here. We need to be flexible, we need to be fair, we need to be valid, which means we must comply with the standards, and we must be consistent. And so this set of standards and this guide to the standards, and I encourage that kind of consistency and validity as we go through the process. So the user guide has a lot of really valuable components. You can approach this by reading it from cover to cover. And look, I know that sounds kind of challenging, but you know, it's not a bad thing to do. Every now and then it's not a bad idea to read a document of this kind, because it gives you that kind of overall perspective. It helps you to integrate one component with another component. It gives you a sense of being in command of the territory if you read the whole thing. So I would suggest you do it if you can. Maybe it's the sort of thing that you set yourself a little schedule and get that overall sense of the integration of all of these components. But of course, it also can be used as a resource for you to cherry pick individual clauses that relate to a particular issue that you're addressing. The standards themselves are made up of two bits, if you like, or two clear components. One is the standard, and the other is and it talks about the standard. We talk about the standard in broad terms, and then the individual clauses. Some of these things are quoted verbatim from the standards. It's really important that we do that, because we do not want to paraphrase or change the meaning of the words. So the standard, the context of the standard are exactly taken from the original document. But then there is a discussion about the benefits of the standard, and the standard is described in broad terms. It's in a sense paraphrased, but linked to the clauses. And then for each clause, we go through and we look at what the clause is in its precise language, taken from, again, from the standard. But then there's a discussion of what these mean for your RTO, what sort of evidence you might provide for compliance. There are, on occasion, case studies, and we look at also at the relationship of one clause to another. So let's look at each of those in a little bit more detail. If we look in the standards themselves, you'll find that at the beginning of a standard, so if we look here at standard 1, you'll find that there is the standard in bold type, and it's quoted directly from the standards for RTOs. So that's not telling you anything that you won't already find from here, but it does provide that with its commentary all in one document, and that's handy. But then and then it provides the context further down on the page. Over the page, though, you'll find on the next screen that we talk about the benefits of the standard. Now, in that process, there's a consideration of the different stakeholders that are involved. So there are learners who are clearly stakeholders, industry and employers. I mean, of course, our competency standards and our RTOs exist to serve the needs of industry. There's governments that play, both federal and state, which play a very significant role in both managing the benefits of training, and managing policy in relation to training, and managing the standards themselves. So governments are key stakeholders. Of course, the community, and we're moving a little bit away from the immediate stakeholders, but you can see that the community is going to benefit from RTOs following high quality standards and working in a consistent way. And so the community and the benefits of each of the standards to the community is discussed. Finally, we look at providers, yourselves in this particular case, and ask, well, how are these standards contributing to you? And that really is important, because there is a tendency to think the standards are something loaded upon you as a kind of burden for everyone else's benefit. And it's important to keep reminding ourselves that these standards are for our benefits of RTOs as well as all the other stakeholders, that in fact it contributes to your effective management and your decision making and your policy making and application. Then the next part is what's called a standard overview. And the standard overview is, it takes the clauses, sometimes one by one, sometimes a little collection of clauses, and provides a kind of a paraphrase of each of those collections, so that you can read through the dot points and get a sense of where this standard is taking you. And that really does provide you with a kind of sense of the whole picture of the standard. Thereafter, we move into the standard clause by clause, and sometimes those clauses are done as individual clauses, sometimes they're done as a collective of clauses. So on the slide you're looking at now, clause 1.1 and 1.2 and 1.3 and 1.4 are spelt out in full in their original format. But the discussion that follows looks at the big collection of clauses, clauses 1.1 to 1.4, to provide you with a sense of the interrelationship between those. These clauses don't stand alone as separate items. They are interrelated with each other, and so they're treated as a collection. And that collection is then discussed in terms of what these mean for your RTO. So we talk about the kind of focus and purpose and impact of the clauses and what they can provide in terms of support for your practices and processes, and the way in which the benefits that were talked about at the beginning can actually be achieved and realised through the way you work as an RTO. So when you read that, you're reading a narrative. It's very much now in the kind of discussion, the kind of dialogue phase, where the TAC is talking with you about the sorts of things that you need to do in relation to these clauses. It's fundamentally what it says, and that is what it means for you. Then, of course, there's that little hard edge, that little steely moment which says, well, you don't have absolute freedom, you do need to comply with this clause. So there it follows a guide to compliance. But in the guide to compliance, it talks about the kind of evidence that you would need to offer to demonstrate acceptable outcomes. And it needs to be understood again that we are not being highly prescriptive about what you do, but how what you do achieves the outcomes in the standard. So if we're looking at standard 1s to 4, there will be different strategies that different RTOs will adopt. But nonetheless, each of those strategies must ultimately be able to be demonstrated to be compliant with clauses 1 through to 4. And I'm just picking on those because they're the ones that we started with in our slide set. So you can see that the Guide to Compliance has that kind of edge to it, which says, here we are carrying back to the standards and saying, whatever you do, being flexible and responsive and innovative, must at some point be able to be connected back to demonstration of compliance. And so there's a discussion about the Guide to Compliance that enables you to see how these things hook together. After the Guide to Compliance, you'll find that there may be some case studies. And the case studies are there to provide you a kind of reasonably realistic image of what the sort of things might apply. And again, what TAC is trying to do here is to be encouraging for you to not only couch your understanding of these standards in a real world, but also to understand that there will be different ways in which you might adopt and approach this. So please do not see the case studies as a statement of this is what you should do, but merely a kind of illustration of what could happen. And it is in part a way of encouraging you to be responsive, and of course always in encouraging you to be compliant and consistent with the standards. So the case studies are there to give you that kind of realistic sense of how you convert a kind of abstract set of standards into some real processes and procedures. Then, of course, we have indicated that all of these clauses, all of these components do form an integrated whole. And so it really becomes important that there be a discussion of how the clauses that you've been looking at link to other clauses. And so an analysis has been done as we've gone through the process of reviewing, for example, clauses 1.1 through to 1.4, as you see on the screen. It needs to be, there will be cross-references to other components. For example, industry engagement links into this collection, which of course is the next clause. Educational support services, because you're talking in 1.1 through to 1.4 about providing services to students to enable them to achieve their outcomes. And that means that you need to understand that not only the variations in your cohorts of students, but how you might support the students to achieve their objectives. And that's referenced in 1.1 and it's referenced in 1.2 in terms of the amount of training. It's referenced in 1.3 when we talk about student support services and educational services in that context. And so you can see that these clauses 1.1 through to 1.4 don't stand alone, but do link across to other components. And you'll find that the link section at the end of each group of clauses provides you with that ability to then bounce forward or even go back in your guide and look at what it says there, just to refresh your minds about how these things link together. I did indicate earlier in the piece that this is a document to be used by RTO or organisations seeking to become RTOs, going through that initial registration process. And it might have been tempting to produce two guides, one for the initial registration and one for continuing registration. Rather than do that, because at the end of the day, you're all in the same game, all working to the same standards. There's only one set of standards that apply. It was decided that rather than create two different documents, that there would be paragraphs or sections that were distinctly applicable to an RTO that was applying, or an organisation that was applying to become an RTO. And so they've been marked as set in shadow box and set with an exclamation mark to say this is something that particularly applies to you. It doesn't mean you ignore it. If you're continuing RTO, it mightn't be a bad idea for you to look at it because there's information in there, but it is something really important if an organisation is seeking to become an RTO. Of course, the other thing is that the user guide is part of a collection of resources produced by TAC. And so when we are looking at the user's guide and the information it provides, it is very appropriate that there also be cross-referencing to TAC's fact sheets. And of course, there is a fabulous collection of fact sheets that TAC has put together. You can be recognised by their distinctive cover. Of course, these fact sheets are like the user guide, providing guidance and advice and suggestions. Apart from the points where they quote the standards, it is merely advice, and you need to make sure that you don't see these as an imposition of a particular point of view, but rather that you see these as an expression of how the standards can be interpreted in a way which enables you to be responsive and flexible to meet individual needs and the needs of industry and of your community. So it's when we look at the fact sheets, like the user guide, they're providing you with advice. So if we look at the next slide, we can see that story once again writ large, and that is the standards provide the regulatory requirements. And it's the standards against which you're audited. It's the standards which you must always have in the back of your mind when you're putting together your processes or reviewing and revising your processes and procedures and policies. But to help you with that, because there's always a component of interpretation in order for you to be responsive and innovative and flexible, there is the user guide and the fact sheets. And these provide that advice and suggestions and ideas linked directly to the standards to assist with compliance and encourage you to be innovative and responsive and produce quality policies, products, procedures and practices so that at the end of the day, you're able to say, on the one hand, we are an organisation that's unique, that is responsive, that has a character and an ethos of its own, and yet is an organisation that complies in a consistent way with the standards, so that you share with other RTOs that strength of compliance with a meaningful set of standards, and yet you have the flexibility and responsiveness that you can be yourself as an RTO. As auditors, that's important too, and I'm going to throw my own little chip in here and say one of the things that's always important when you're dealing with an auditor is that you talk about your ethos and your approach, your client group, your cohort, your resources, your community, because the standards themselves have to be understood within the context of that. So we need to see how you are working within that framework, using the guide and the fact sheets to, at the end of the day, comply with those strong regulatory standards that are always there in our thinking and against which you must always be audited. So we have one or two more slides, and one, of course, is the other TAC resources. And here you can see a whole range of, these are all TAC fact sheets that are available to you. So there are fact sheets which, as Marina said at the beginning, represents TAC's understanding of where you need support and advice and assistance. And that set of TAC fact sheets has been expanding and growing over time to respond to identified needs, identified through audits or identified through webinars and workshops or identified through just individual consultations and advice and sharing between ourselves and you as RTOs. So I don't expect this is the final word on the fact sheets. It's a very comprehensive set, but there will always be other areas and where a bit of extra support and advice is needed. Do check on the version of the fact sheet, because these fact sheets are revised and updated to represent the latest thinking and the latest ideas, and to communicate as effectively as possible. Finally, I need to draw your attention to the fact that, of course, there is the TAC website. And this website it provides you through a range of links to various resources, of course, including the user's guide and the fact sheets, but other resources as well, and forms and documents and procedures and processes, general announcements, educational programs and the like. So please feel free to and get comfortable with and explore the TAC website. It's a resource with which you should feel very comfortable and should make a regular use of in your work as an RTO. Can I say thank you very much for being with us this morning? Really good to talk with you about this exciting document. I think it represents a really significant aspect of TAC's interface between itself and RTOs. And of course, you've got the direct contacts that you can make to TAC through their telephone line, through emails and through web, and of course through webinars in the future. Thanks very much for participating.